In this episode of AAillustrates, we're going to dive into the JSON package, and we want to understand exactly what benefits can be gained from using this package, and we're going to talk about exactly how to use it so that you can appropriately read and parse a JSON file or a response body. So this was first available in the Automation 360.24 release, so you're able to use that if you're an on-prem customer and you've downloaded .24 or above. You'll have access to this package. If you're using Automation Anywhere Community Edition or Automation Anywhere Cloud customer, then your control room has already been updated to include this new package. Now, before we dive too much into it, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's basically a systematic way for being able to store data and values in almost like a key value pair system. So where would you actually use this package? Well, first off, you can use it for parsing JSON files, and a JSON file could be used for storing configurations, maybe environmental settings that you want to reference within your bot. Both of those are great use cases for using a JSON file to store some kind of data, reading it into your bot, and using that for processing whatever the bot needs to do. Another, and probably the most common use case of using this particular package, is parsing a response from the REST web service actions. So if I make a GET call with my REST web service package, I can then receive back a response body. That response body will come to me in the form of JSON. This package, this JSON package, enables me to parse that response and make sense of whatever data is in there. We're going to take a look at a JSON sample response here in a little bit, and we'll talk about exactly how we can get all of the data out of that particular response body. The final option for using this is probably a little bit more unique, but if you are parsing documents in a NoSQL database like MongoDB, this would be another option for you to use the JSON package. And again, probably not as common. The most common use case for using this is when you're using the REST web service package. Inside of this package, there are 4 total actions. We have start session, which enables us to establish a session either based off of a file or based off of a string, which could be our response body. Get node value, where we can get a specific node value from the JSON. Get node list, where it's going to return a list of values if there is an array within that JSON, and we'll look at how that works. And then end session, and it's important that you end session. We're going to look at why that matters here in a little bit, because if I start a session and I, let's say, read some values from that and I don't end it, and I try to use the JSON package again to start another session, I'm going to get some issues. So if you're using the start, you want to make sure you also use the corresponding end. So in this demo and tutorial here that we're going to do, we want to look at 3 things. A, how can I fetch a value from a JSON? B, how can I return a list of values? And then B, 2, whatever. 3, how do I parse a list of values? So I've got a list back. How do I read values out of that? And I'm going to show you 2 different approaches for doing that. So let's jump right in. Now, to assist us for today, I have loaded up a sample JSON file to GitHub, and I'm going to put this URL in the description below so you have that. It's on the Automation Anywhere GitHub. You do want to view it as a raw data so that you can see it like this format. What we're going to do is we're going to use the get action from the RESTful Web Services package to basically fetch this. This will be our response body, and then we want to parse that to make sure we can read from it. Now, if we just look at the format of this, we can see that some data exists at that root level, right? So the user count, the API version, last updated, all of that data exists at the root level of my JSON. So that should be pretty easy for me to read. But then notice we have this users object, which is actually an array, right? And so we have JSON objects inside of that that represent each of our users. So we have Karen Stevens, Greg Daniels, Vibhu Soni. So we have all of these users inside of that. And we're going to have to figure out how we can return this as a list and then iterate through that list to be able to read the data for the first name and last name for each of our employees, right? So I'm going to copy this URL and jump over to the control room so we can get started here. And let me log in. Okay, I'm going to go to my automation tab. Again, I'm using Automation 360 Cloud. If you're using Community Edition, this will work totally fine. You can do the exact same thing I'm doing. So I have a folder that I've created for AAillustrates. I think I've created a folder for the JSON package. I'm just going to create a new bot in here, and I'm going to call this JSON underscore AAillustrates and hit create and edit. Sidebar here, it's really important that as you're creating your bots, and especially as you're doing this for your organization or for a customer, if you're doing consulting, make sure you have a standard for the way that you create your bot names, also for the way that you store your bots, right? In some kind of logical hierarchy of folders. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a huge mess of a bunch of random bots in the root of your bots directory, and maintaining and updating and identifying like whose is this and whose is that is going to be an absolute nightmare. So as you get started with your bot building, even if you've already kind of screwed this up in the past, start today with creating a systematic pattern for the way that you're going to store your bots. All right, back on task. So the first thing we want to do is I'm going to use that REST web services package, and I'm going to use the get method. Okay, and this is how we can interact with RESTful web services. In our case, we're really just going to be reading that directly from GitHub, which is why I did it the way I did. So I'm going to copy this URL, and again, this is in the description below, so you can follow along with me. I'm going to put that in the enter URI here. Now, typically, when I am making a GET request, I might include some kind of parameters in the URL that indicate like what kind of data I'm trying to get back or for what time period or something like that. But because we're just trying to read this as is, we can just enter the URI as it exists. Now, when we get the response back from the RESTful web service call, in this case our GET request, it will return to us a dictionary. Now, I have the ability to receive that as multiple variables, so I can specify like mapping directly to a variable right away, or I can map that back to a dictionary and I just get one variable back and I have to read the specific dictionary values out that I want to use. Now, because I know that the only thing we really care about is this response body, and you might not be able to see this because of my head. I'll move out of the way here. Well, kind of. Anyway, it says use response header name as key to fetch value and body as key to fetch body of response. So what I'm going to do is click this button that says add variable mapping, and my key should be body, just like the instructions there said, and I can map that to a specific variable. Now, I'm going to create a new variable. I'm just going to call this one lowercase s response body and hit create and select and then hit add. So what that's saying is I don't really care about everything else that's coming as a response to this get method call that I just made. I just am concerned about what's in the response body. There's other things that might be like the code, other variables that might come back as a part of that response, but I just want the response body. So we can validate that that's working by using a message box here, and we'll just keep reusing and abusing this message box over and over as we do our testing. So I'm just going to hit save there. I've mapped my response body into that message box, and I want to test to make sure that that's working. So let my bot run, and I should get, yep, that entire JSON that we just saw, right? And it looks kind of weird and unformatted here, but as we saw it in the other page, it looked pretty clean and was pretty formatted. So the first thing we said we want to do is just read a single value out of this JSON. So let's read the last updated date time here. Now notice that this is formatted as a string, which is fine, right? I can convert it to a proper date time on the Automation Anywhere side, but let's read this. So what I'm going to do is grab this last updated, which is my key for that value, right? And I will now start my JSON session. So you want to find the JSON package. I have some others that came from BotStore, but for this particular video, we're focusing on the built-in JSON one. So I'm going to say start session. I'm going to put that above my message box. Notice here, like I mentioned, I can start that session off of a file or off of text. One thing that was a bit confusing to me at first is notice it says control room file, desktop file, or variable. If I'm going to put variable here, that needs to be a reference to a specific file. So because ours is just straight text, I do want to use this text one. I'm going to press F2 so I can bring up my Variables Explorer, and I want to put in response body here and hit yes and insert. Now it's going to ask me how I want to set up my JSON object session. Now when I do this, I'm going to do a local session, which means it's only going to be available for within this bot. If I wanted to establish a session, maybe in a parent bot, and then reference that session in a child bot or a subtask, I'd want to do a global session and then pass that value along to that subtask so it knows to expect a session variable. For the purposes of this, we're just going to do a local session. I'm going to call this one default and hit save. So the next thing we want to do is actually get a node value out. I'm going to drag that over. I now want to give the path to that specific value that I want. So I'm going to put in here, I just pasted it, last updated. That's exactly how it shows up in the body that I referenced. And it says, which session do you want to pull that out of? Default was what I gave before. Default's what here, so that's fine. And I'm going to add a variable here, and I'm just going to call this one S, what did we call it? Last updated. And then hit create and select. We'll use our message box again to validate that what we've got is working. So I'm going to change this to last updated in my message box and rerun that. So again, what's happening is it's going to make that request out to our GitHub JSON. It's going to read that and it's going to return to me the value that was found in that last updated field. And in this case, it was the date time of this simulated I don't know, API. Last time it was updated, right? So we have that. So we figured out how to read a single value. And the same process would be true for reading any of these, right? Note that these are Boolean values, right? So question set, password set, those are Boolean. This is a number value. All of those will come back to you in this as a string, right? And you can see that by the quotes here. When they come back to you as a string, you could then convert them to the determined format, which may be a number, maybe a Boolean. In this case, it was a date time, and so I could convert that to a automation anywhere recognized date time if I wanted to. All right, so we want to get our node list, and what we're meaning when we say node list is I want to get everything that's in this array. Okay, so I'm just going to give the path of users, and I should expect that it returns to me all of these individual objects that are found within the users array. So let's drag over the get node list here. For my JSON node key or path, I'm going to put users here. For my output, I don't have a variable. It's going to return to me an actual list, right, as a data type from Automation Anywhere. So I'm going to put in a lowercase l here. And let's say this is called users list. We'll put that. I'll hit create select. Now at this point, there's really two options for how I can read the data out of that list. Before I get into that though, I just want to see what's in the list, right? I want to see what it looks like. To do that, I'm going to use this JavaFX package. And this JavaFX package is available on BotStore. If you're using Community Edition, you can go and download it as a zip and then upload it to your Community Edition environment. If you're using another version of Automation Anywhere, you can go to BotStore, you can download it. You can either make a direct connection to your control room, or you can download it as a zip and kind of air gap it over to control room. Either will work. I'm going to grab this show list and drag this over. And I like using this custom package because it enables me to see some of these different variable types that don't really show up in a message box like a string does. So for my button label, I'm just going to say close. You choose what list you want to display. We only have one, so that's not that hard. And then you give a width and height. And from what I've seen in my testing, the provided width and height don't really matter. So I'm just going to put 500. I'm also commenting out the last updated here, because we don't really need to see that again. So let's hit run. And again, it's going to do that same thing. It's still going to read the last updated value, but we're really not doing anything with it. All right, so this is the display of my list, and I'm going to stretch this out here. Essentially what we have is a bunch of string values, and within each string value, I have, there we go. I have each of those users who exist in that list, right? And so you can see here is Karen Stevens. Here is Karen Stevens represented right here. So this is actually a JSON object, right? And so one way that I could process looping through these is to loop through this list and do a new JSON package session for each item in the list so that I could read out. Let's try to do the first name and the last name. So let's try that first. We'll hit close here. We don't need this anymore. What I'm doing is pressing Control and /, or it's got a question mark and a /, but that's a shortcut for being able to disable actions. So what I'm going to do on the left-hand side is find my loop package. I'm going to drag that over. For my iterator, I'm going to loop through a list. So I'm going to grab list here. What list do I want to iterate through? The L user list. And then what do I want to assign the current value to a variable? So I'm going to press the create variable here. Notice its type is any because we didn't necessarily specify within the list that it has to be a list of strings. In this case it is, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So I can put this as string. You could leave it as any. It's going to work either way. I'm just going to put lowercase s. List item is fine for the naming. I just like to always name mine with the prefix of the variable type. Okay, now what that means is that every time I iterate through that list, I'm going to get one of these JSON objects, right? Like the first time through, I should get this exact thing. So what that means for my loop is that I need to have a new JSON session inside here, right? And for my text, it's going to be based on s list item. And I'll hit yes, insert. Now, I have another session, right? This is like a session inside of a session. So I'm going to call this one, let's say user session. And I'm going to copy that out because we're going to have to reference it a couple times. So that's just started my session. If I want to read a value from it, I'll again give the path. So again, flipping back over here, first lowercase f first, uppercase N, name would be for first name, and last name. Let's try to read just those two values. So I'm going to put first name, my session. It's important that you get this right. My session has to match what I just established, which was user session. Where I want to store that, I'm going to put s first name, create and select, hit save. I'm going to copy that one more time because I want to do last name. So I'll just update this to say last name. Session again needs to be user session. For my variable, I will put s last name and hit create and select. Okay, so we've got that. I want to end my session because if I don't end it and I try to iterate through this again, I'm going to get an error that says, hey, user session already exists, so I can't do that, right? So it's important that every time I iterate through this loop that I'm both establishing the session and closing the session, because every time I iterate through it, I'm establishing a new session off of a new user record here. Okay, the last thing we want to do is I'm going to grab this message box, just paste it up here, and we will put our two variables in there, which is first name and last name, so that we can make sure this thing's actually working. Okay, and I will enable this action. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Basically what we're doing is we're reading the entire collection of users. We're then iterating through that, recognizing that each of these is an individual item in our list. We're treating this as a JSON object and then trying to read values from it. And obviously you could keep going down this path of like, okay, there's a JSON object inside of that, so I have to go inside of that. Oh, we had that message box already, sorry. User session already exists, so let's see what happened here. Oh, we screwed up. Notice here that it says user session default. I didn't change that to user session. So once I update that, we should be good. What was the pop-up that we saw? Oh, this didn't save. Let's update that to first name and last name. Last name. Okay, now we for sure have that. Now let's run this. Yeah, so that's why I was preaching how important it is to make sure that you close those sessions, because even I screwed it up here. So Karen Stevens was our first employee. I'll leave this up here. If I hit close, we should get Greg Daniels, Bibu Soni, Sarah Nielsen, and Jignesh. So that worked. We were able to read through all of the different employees or users in our list. I do want to show you one other way to process a list though, and one that I personally prefer a bit better. So we saw how to do that one. When we get our user list, we have some properties related to that list. And if I go to the list package over here, what I can see is I can get a value that's called size. So I'm going to drag that over. And here I just select a list, and then I select where I want to store the value of that size. So I'm going to put in list size, and I'll hit save. Now that should come back to me and say that there are 5 objects in this list, right? And we kind of already know it here because this was a value, but we're doing it as if we didn't know how large this array was, and it was a variable array, right? Sometimes there's 3, sometimes there's 5, sometimes there's 26. So we're doing this as dynamic as possible. So this is going to tell us our user list size. What we can do then is create a loop based on the size of that list. And we're going to say for n number of times, my number of times is going to be the length of my list, which is n list size. And then I want to have a current variable, or almost a counter or an iterator. So I'm going to hit the create variable here. Counter is selected, that's fine. I'm just going to put a lowercase n here to prefix it, n counter, hit create and select. Okay. Now, if you tried to do this on your own, you may have gotten an issue that said like index out of bounds, right? If we just tried to read the values from like the first one and the second one and the third one, we would be missing this very first one, because what happens is when we're referencing these as a JSON, we're doing it by their index, not by their count. And so that's a different thing, right? An index is going to be 0 based. A count would be 1 based. So what that means for us here is that we can still use our existing JSON session that we've established, but when we say get value, let me see. Well, one thing let's see, get value, get node value. I'm going to leave it at default here because that's the one we were using before. I don't need a new JSON session for this approach. But here I have to give a path to where that value exists. Now the way that I would do that is I'm going to say users, and then I can actually give the index. So let's put users in square brackets. I can put the index. Now if I said index 0 dot first name, that would give me the first name of the index 0 for my users array. Now that is cool, right? That would allow me to get Karen Stevens detail, but I want this to be a little bit more dynamic. So because I have that counter value, I know counter is going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? But I need to treat that index slightly differently. So what I'm going to do is grab a number package here, and I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to do assign. I guess I could do decrement, but I'm going to do assign. And what I'm going to assign is my n counter minus 1, and I'm going to set that to n index. Okay. And then in my path here, instead of hard coding user 0, what I'm going to put is $n, what do we call it? N index, $. Now it's going to complain there saying that, hey, you can't do that because that's a number and I'm expecting a string. So what we can do is type dot, and then notice that there's some dot notation shortcuts that come up. I can decrement it, I could increment it. Here I'm going to say toString. So I've said users, and then I've got my index value, which was number toString dot first name. and I'm going to store that in the first name variable. I'll save. I'm going to copy that exact same thing. I'm going to do that for the last name. Last name. I've already got that variable. We're good. And then I'll do a message box just like we did before. And we'll call this one, oh, we want to do first name and last name here. So let's run this one more time. We should get the same result that we just had, right? Where it's going to go through and tell us each person's name. So Karen Stevens, Greg Daniels, Vibhu, Sarah, and Jignesh. And that worked. Okay, so in recap, when I want to just read a single value, I give the path to that. And if it's a path that's a couple layers deep, that's fine. I can do that. I can hard code it, or I can set it as variables. If I want to get a list back, I can return a node list. And then if I want to iterate through that list, there's two options for doing that. I can iterate through the returned list and treat each of those returned JSON objects individually and create separate sessions for all of those. Or I could just use the counter method that I just showed here to reference exactly the index of the object that I'm trying to reference. So two different approaches there. Honestly, I don't think one is necessarily better or worse than the other. I think it's really comes down to what you're most comfortable with. And if that's the first way or the second way, that's totally fine. So thanks so much for hanging out for this AAillustrates. Be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps us to understand what kind of content people want to see. It helps us to engage with the developer audience, which is always awesome and fun to do. So my name is Micah Smith. Thanks for joining. Go be great. We're constantly putting out new Automation Anywhere content. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming tutorials and bot builds. Go be great.